Hi, friends.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the next installment of Lit Chats with Ray and Hadley, or Hadley and Ray, however you want to say it. Lit Chat. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about the poetry of Langston Hughes, specifically two of his poems, Harlem and Dreams. So we're going to do a bit of an overview about Langston Hughes himself, our experience with him, and then talk a bit about the poems so that you are prepared for some comparative analysis of the two.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So Langston Hughes is known as like the innovator of jazz poetry. He is an American poet, a Black poet, who became very popular during a time known as the Harlem Renaissance. How do you want to kick us off a little bit about that Harlem Renaissance?
Sure. So in the 20s and 30s, we started to see an explosion of art from Black America, and it kind of originated in this like 3-block radius in Harlem. And it was jazz music and literature and poetry and even plays and painting.
And
Um, and
fashion and dance.
Yeah, all of it, just everything that you could think of. And it came, post people migrating up to New York after slavery was abolished, and they were starting to find their voice. And they were starting to, I can't say they were getting accepted, but the art was becoming accepted. If the people were not, the art was becoming accepted into a more of a mainstream idea. And there were clashes within those artists in the Harlem Renaissance about who the art was for and what its importance was. And Langston Hughes was definitely on the forefront of that. And when I went to New York, the first time I went to New York on my own, one of my main goals was to go to Harlem and kind of take in that 3-block radius. And I spent like 5 hours just like in that radius and trying to soak in all of that. So that's kind of a quick and dirty overview. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think you covered probably most of it for me. I just think it's such an important moment of our history that's often kind of passed over in schools because there's so much to get through, but definitely a very crucial piece of African American history and the development of Black culture and that voice, that national voice that finally was starting to be listened to during that time, even though, as Mr. Hadley said, the acceptance varied within and amongst those artists and those creators. But hugely important, and so much of what was developed during that time in history still remains constant in our culture today as very important. Like we look at the origins of rock and roll in the Harlem Renaissance. We look at blues. There's poetry. There's jazz poetry. This idea of poetry breaking free of format, so that it's almost like instrumental jazz in its innovative, improvised way of really kind of speaking. And this idea that poetry is for the people. And it's not just for those who are, college educated or can understand the like vast and complicated metaphors of Shakespeare or other classic poets, but instead getting into this idea of poetry for the people and a voice for the people through much of what was developed during the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, and actually that leads right into Langston Hughes, because at the time there were a lot of scholars who did not think his poetry was worthy because it was plain spoken, and it didn't follow. I mean, it's, we've had tons of poets that have used free verse, which is a style of poetry that doesn't rely on really any kind of form or boundaries or meters or anything. And there were a lot of scholars, even in his day, some of the prominent like Black scholars of the day didn't appreciate Langston Hughes' poetry because it was so plain spoken and of the language of the people. But without it, we don't have the beat poets. Without Langston Hughes, we don't have the beat poets of the 50s that are so romanticized, especially in California.
The Ginsbergs of the world.
Yeah. But it all comes from not just Hughes, but Hughes was kind of the dominant poetic voice of the time. And to be honest, Hughes is the poet that we read in schools. And he's the reason I love poetry. I don't know if I've ever told you that before.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I, in high school, was very much like everybody else in the world in high school, which is like, poetry is so stupid. And like, I couldn't get it. And then in my AP Lit, my junior year, during our Gatsby study, our teacher let us choose a topic for research, and I chose the Harlem Renaissance of the 20s and 30s in jazz, and I discovered Langston Hughes, and suddenly poetry like made sense because it was so plain spoken, and because it like obviously didn't speak to my struggle, but it spoke to a struggle that felt, because of the way he wrote it, it felt universal.
Mm-hmm.
All this stuff about, and especially the two poems we're going to look at today, all about dreams and what happens to them. And so he was my entrance into poetry in general. I don't know what my life would be like had I not discovered Langston Hughes for myself when I was 16 years old.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes him so, I think, impactful still today, is just how universal his poetry is. Even if it doesn't speak to our personal experience, he brings so much experience into his poetry. He had lived in 6 different cities before he began writing his work, primarily in the Harlem area of New York. So he had this kind of vast collection of knowledge. He had done so many different like occupations and jobs, had traveled back and forth from the United States to Africa as well. So he had all of this background coming into his writing. And I think that that's really presented in the work that he was able to create and share with the society, and that we see all of these different perspectives. He's also renowned, often not taught, but something to consider is he is renowned as one of the first queer poets as well. While he was never an out gay man, there are many scholars who look to his poetry and see what's called coded language, which was language at the time gay people were not accepted, even more so then than now. And it was something where they had to speak and find ways to communicate with each other through what was called coded language, where these were like hints that could be dropped into their writing, their songs, their poetry, that kind of spoke to others who were part of that community as a way to say like, hey, I see you, I'm one of you. And we see lots of that language throughout Langston Hughes's poetry. Some believe he was homosexual, some look that he was asexual, but there is certainly an element of queerness when we consider that history for Langston Hughes. And that also gives us kind of some intersectionality as well of the things and the oppression that he experienced, because not only as a Black man, but also as a queer man. So it definitely came up kind of in the circles that he ran with and in that coded language that we see in his poetry.
Yeah, I did not know that there were thoughts of asexuality from him. I had, there's a movie about his life. I can't recall the name of it, but Anthony Mackie plays him. And I think that they hint at bisexuality in the film, but even in the film, they were afraid to put some of that presentation forward. A queer Black poet in the 1920s and 1930s, like imagine the internal struggle of having those two things on top of each other, to be a Black man in the 1920s and 1930s, and then be a queer Black man on top of that. And yeah, you can see a lot of the coded language. Somewhere in this apartment, I have a volume that was literally everything he ever wrote is in that giant volume. And you can see a lot of that coded language in there for sure. I think it's such an important aspect of him, but it's something that I don't think I was, even in the classes I have read his poetry in, I'm not sure that was ever taught, his queerness at all. Yeah. Which is just a shame.
All right, you ready to dig into these poems?
Yeah, which one do you want to look at first?
I guess let's start with Harlem.
Okay.
You want to give us a reading of that bad boy?
Yeah. Sure.
This is probably his most famous poem.
Yes, and then there's also a very famous play whose title comes from a line of this and is thematically lined up to the poem in a lot of ways. And I think your junior year you do excerpts. I mean, I think you maybe read the whole thing.
Yeah. The Rain Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah. All right. Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
So definitely a powerful, powerful piece of writing. So short, so succinct, like so much of Langston Hughes's poetry. And we see that free verse come into play here. This repeated set of rhetorical questions that look at kind of the nature of dreams that are deferred, dreams that we kind of push off and say, not yet. Yeah. What part of this speaks most to you, Mr. Hadley?
So it's always right at the end. Or does it explode? Like, how long can we push off a dream before something explodes? Whether it's ourselves, our rage, whether it's the dream that explodes and drives us crazy. I like the ambiguity of what exactly is exploding, like the dream itself, and what does that cause? I'm always, and I mean, this is a poem I revisit over and over again. I mean, I don't know how you can be so good in such an economy of language, but just the power of the end. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? And there's that juxtaposition between those two things too. Like, does it just weigh on you, or will it eventually just explode in your face? And it's that reminder of, like, my first thought is always like, it's a reminder of to chase your dreams, as like cliche as that seems. But when you put it in the context of Langston Hughes, and especially when you put it in tandem with some of what his other poetry is doing, you realize, like, it might not be that he's allowed to chase those dreams, that the speaker is not allowed to. And this is a poem born out of fear of death, because you don't have that dream, right? Like that kind of is the thing for me. What about you? What's the thing that stands out the most to you in this poem?
I love the imagery of, does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? This idea of just things that are decaying. Like, if we just push off our dreams, that the just utter rot that can be experienced within us and outside of us as well. And I think that it speaks not only to the person and their dream personally, in that idea of like it exploding within you and that rage and letting those dreams go, but I think it also speaks to the overall society and who he was speaking to with this poem. Like, I think that just so much of that idea of looking at Black America at the time, and this idea of having these dreams, having these goals, having faced oppression for years, and oppression that will continue to come. But if these dreams, right, these things that we hold on to and this hope that's associated with it, to just keep that in and not kind of work as a community, can result in rot and decay of not only your dreams, but of that society itself. Or if we continue to hold it in, does it eventually explode out in a way that's just uncontrollable? And that makes me think of like the explosion of the Harlem Renaissance. Like, all of this art is an explosion as well. So I think it's really interesting that, and each time I read it, I get a different kind of connotation there of like, is that explosion personal? Is it negative? Is it positive? Is it like an explosion of creativity? Just really interesting stuff. I love it. Sorry.
I have never considered the explosion as a creativity. And I've read this poem, I don't know, 50, 100 times in my life, and I love that. I've never thought about it in that way before, because so much of the imagery of the poem is negative, but like, how much of art does come out of tons of negativity, right? Like, I think that's a really interesting reading of that poem.
Like it's like you hold us down and our dreams are constantly deferred, and you're keeping those dreams from us, but just you wait. like, boom, here it is.
Oh, man. You can't see it, but there's like hair standing on end over here. I love that reading. That's so cool. What do you make of the structure of the poem? What are your thoughts on the structure of the poem?
I mean, I think it's just so brilliant. It really is. These short, just everything being like a short, succinct sentence, those rhetorical questions, one after the other, ending with that question that does leave so many interpretations, which is what's so beautiful about it. And I think what's so beautiful about poetry in general is this idea that there's not one right way to analyze poetry, right? It is metaphorical in nature, and that leaves it open to interpretation based on experience. But I think structurally, the short stanzas, one sentence long, most of them, I mean, all of them, one sentence long stanzas with all those rhetorical questions. It really just, it speaks to you, and it makes you look inside of yourself and ask yourself these questions. What does happen?
One of the things that always strikes me in this poem is how the use of the rhetorical questions force you to keep reading.
Mm-hmm.
Like really kind of, it's like there's a momentum to the poem. And I think you're talking about the shortness of it, right? Is that, and then you get this like brief respite, it seems like, from the rhetorical questions. Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Like that's not a rhetorical question, that's a statement. But then to hit you one more time at the end, like you get just this like moment to breathe with it before it hits you with this ending rhetorical question that just like is a gut punch in so many ways. It's also a way to show that, you know, if you use similes well, they can actually be a really effective, like similes get a bad rap because so many similes are poor, they're poorly done. But here you see just some brilliant uses of the simile. What do you think of the rhymes?
I like that they are minimal. I really do. We see like sun and run, meet and sweet. I feel like we have these rhymes that are used so intentionally as a way to really kind of impact without it sounding like a fully rhymed poem, which is so wonderful. And then having in those last two stanzas no rhymes at all, I think helps to make it stand out even more. But that does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore, and then run. We have that rhyme scheme minimally used and used effectively.
Yeah. How good of a word is fester?
Oh God.
Fester like a sore. Ugh. It's just, yeah, it's that it kind of just sends gross feelings up your spine. Like there are so many words you could use in that, right? But to have such a evocative, and there's a few of them in here, right? Like crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet, which at first doesn't, I mean, as someone who likes really sweet food, doesn't sound so bad. But when you put it all together in one, crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet, too much. And when you only have a handful of words that you're going for, I mean, you have to choose the most evocative language, and few do it better in fewer words than Langston Hughes does.
Yeah. And those words too being so active, right? Like fester. The wound isn't just there and it's not just present, it is festering. And a festering wound is one that causes infection and can continue to spread and to take over other parts of the body and pass to other bodies. Like it's all just, it's so good.
Yeah. It's, I mean, and this was the poem for me. Like when I said that this poem is the reason why I fell in love with poetry. It is this specific poem, and it's his most famous for a reason.
Yeah,
absolutely. All right, do you want to read us Dreams?
Sure. All right, Dreams. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. Dreams.
Again, so few words, yet such evocative images. And one thing you find in a lot of, I think you find it a lot of poetry, but I think you find in a lot of the works of the Harlem Renaissance are images of birds,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and that's something that our students will see in sympathy
Yeah.
as well. The image of this bird, life as a broken winged bird, as that cannot fly. And I like the follow up. For some reason, it makes it better when it's the cannot fly. Like, we know that a broken winged bird cannot fly, but making it that much clearer for whatever reason speaks more to me. And so that's the thing that I look to the first, is this life as is the two things that life is. Life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Life is a barren field frozen with snow. Like, a barren field is already bad.
Mm-hmm.
It's brown and dark, and it cannot give life. But then you add on top of that even more that it's now frozen with snow on top of it. It's just adding another layer to it. What about you? What are the things that first catch you about this poem?
I think the thing that always catches me here, and that each time I try to analyze it, I come to kind of a different conclusion, is the if and the when. In our two stanzas, our first is hold fast to your dreams, because if they die, if you don't, then this is the result. And then our second stanza, hold fast to dreams for when dreams go. So there's that if, and then there's that when. And so I get kind of back and forth on, like, is this a message of hope, or is this speaking a different side, which is one of the things that Langston Hughes was criticized for, was for speaking frankly about the experience of, like, you know what? Sometimes it doesn't turn out okay. And sometimes you work and you work and you work, but there are things that are going to hold you back. And it kind of relates to that American dream concept that we've talked about before. So this idea that when dreams go, it's not only a barren field, like, it's not only that nothing is growing there now, but that snow added on top. It's just like the piling on of the circumstances that are going to make it. But you still have to hold fast to them. And I think that's that piece of hope, is that hold fast, and that active voice of, like, boom, that command, that provides a little bit of hope. But I think that it's stark reality of the nature of dreams in this poem is so wonderful. We think like poets and dreams, and like, oh, here's going to be this fanciful take on the power of dreams and the importance of dreams, and dreams come true, and like that kind of Disneyified concept of it. But here we see something a little bit different for when dreams go. I think that when is really powerful.
Yeah, it's like the inevitability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of there's no way that all of the things we dream are going to come true.
Yeah.
It's just not possible. And you're right, he was criticized often for the lack of, like, something optimistic to hold on to in the struggles, right? That something to look forward to, because he was speaking so frankly, and he was speaking for the working, tired person who was going through these things. Yeah, isn't it crazy how two small words like if or when can have such an impact on a piece of writing? Like, just hold fast to dreams for if dreams die, hold fast to dreams for when dreams go.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So maybe they don't die, but maybe you realize it's never going to happen, right? Yeah. And that holding on to it is the only thing, is your only way through it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that, if and when.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we've got 4 lines and two stanzas, 4 lines each. We do have another rhyme, but again, it's a simple rhyme, right? Die, fly, go, snow. They're not complex, and they don't have to be.
No.
Like, I think people get this idea that poetry is supposed to be complex and difficult, and it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. It's like he took that idea of it being inaccessible and made it instead so available to anyone. Like, while he was college educated, his work wasn't limited to those who were.
Yeah. Well, and he chooses, and you know, you look at both poems, but the second poem, like he chooses images that everyone who has an ability to read or listen, no, everyone can get an image of a broken winged bird.
Yeah.
Everyone can get an image of a barren field and what it looks like to be frozen with snow. Like it's not, these things don't have to be difficult to be powerful and emotive. And that's such a great thing for, I think for all of us. I mean, even me at, you know, near 40, when I try to write things, I always get stuck on making them complex, and then I harken back to this, and then, like his style of poetry, and obviously not the way, not his themes often, but his style of poetry is often the kind of stuff that, and you know this better than anyone, the kind of stuff, the way I write in free verse. I write because when I try to write in a form or I try to rhyme, it goes so horribly awry. But he does it so well. And in these two poems especially. Any other thoughts on Dreams, the poem?
No, I think we hit most of kind of what I think about it, that the beautiful metaphors that exist throughout, the accessible metaphors, the rhythm of it as well, that he recited a lot of his poetry so that it was, again, accessible to those who were illiterate and couldn't read the poems. He would go and do these recitations of his poems so that they could be experienced and enjoyed, really, truly for all.
Yeah. And you'd be hard pressed to find another poet that has as many famous pieces as he does. I Too Sing America, Theme for English B. Like he's got so many poems that are really well known. And you can find some really great recitations of his poetry on YouTube. You can find tons of them on YouTube. There's a great one from the movie The Great Debaters of Denzel Washington standing on a table or a chair reciting I Too Am America. That is certainly evocative because his words lend to it. His words just lend to it. This really like performative, evocative nature of what words are capable of. I love this.
Huge fan.
Yeah, me too. Any last words for either of these poems?
I don't think so. I just encourage students to seek out more of what the Harlem Renaissance had to offer. Look at the artwork, look at more poetry, listen to some songs. Oh my God, just all of it. Soak it in, take it in, because it's such an important piece of American history.
Yeah, I agree. And seek out other writers than just Langston Hughes too. I know some of you are probably going to read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God over the summer. She's probably the dominant woman writer from the Harlem Renaissance. But there's so much good art. It's such a unique era of art. And to think it all came from this tiny little radius of space is remarkable.
Yeah. All right, friends. We hope you've enjoyed our lit chats.
Until next time.
Bye.
Bye.